So the second hour today I will devote to putting a value on collective goods. How can we do that? What we need is, first of all, a model, a mathematical model for collective goods. And this mathematical model has to be general enough to include all these things that we talked about. I will simplify the world in which we operate a little bit. I will abstract away from the production network essentially. We assume there are only consumption commodities, nothing else. And then collective goods. And the collective goods could be intermediary goods or consumption goods. Yeah, so either possible. Anyway, so all commodities are consumable, and that means the commodity space is the consumption space. No intermediary goods, everything is taken away from that. Now, how do we then introduce in this world collective goods? Well, since they can be anything really, we need to do that in the most general way, and that is then that we have a completely unstructured set of what we can call configurations. So an implementation of a collective good is called a configuration. It could be a system of law, it could be collective knowledge that we somehow create together. It could be a commons, like we have before, and it could be streetlights. So all of these things we can capture in an abstract set. It can be measurable, it might also not be measurable. So that is the basis of the model. Right? Now we also know that collective goods have this widespread impact on everything, consumptive preferences as well as productive abilities, because these are essentially inputs also for the production processes. If I have a road system, this is clearly an input for our production processes, as well as something that you would consume when you go on a vacation trip with the family in a car. You use the road system. Well, that is consumption activity in principle. And so it should be showing up in your preferences, and the road system in the same way will impact productivity and all that in the production sets, as we call that. Yeah. Remember, we have consumer producers still. Consumer producers have a utility function on the consumption side, and on the production side, they have a production set, which can be subject to increasing internal specialization or not. It depends a little bit on the specification of the model. Yeah. So usually there is, of course, increasing internal specialization, but this is not the important thing here. Okay, what do we need to talk about with regard to these collective goods? First of all, whatever incarnation the collective good has, whatever configuration we talk about, it has to be produced, it has to be created. And we use possibly all these commodities for that. So we use, in principle, all L commodities can be used in a certain quantity to produce this collective good. Yeah. Now, that bundle that is required to produce configuration Z is then called C of Z. So C suddenly becomes then a function that assigns to every configuration a bundle of commodities, quantities of commodities that are used in the provision of this particular configuration. Yeah, and so we talk about a collective good cost function. Now, agents operate in the social division of labor, as we have done throughout this module, and they create these commodities. And so a government or an authority can be paying for those collective commodities, for those regular commodities, market prices, and in order to create or to deliver or to provide configuration of the collective good. Yeah, so that is the model that we are talking about. Now, productive abilities of an agent are described by this production set, but now that becomes subject to the configuration of the collective good. If I have a certain road system, I am productive in a certain way. If I have a commons of a certain quality, I am productive in a certain way. Yeah, so productivity is in principle subject to whatever configuration we have. So it is a function of this Z, in other words. Consumption the same way. The Z, it just features in the consumption, on the consumption side, in the preferences. So I have preferences over Z. And if Z is not a consumable, then of course it's absent, but that is a special case, right? So that is perfectly possible here. We will see that in an example, but that I will describe a little bit later on. So I have a function that assigns to every consumption bundle and collective good configuration now a utility function, a utility level. Yeah. Okay. Given this setup, given that we have now commodities, collective good configurations, production sets that are depending on collective good configurations, and preferences assigned to bundles of commodities and collective good configurations, what can we then do with regard to assigning a value to these collective good configurations? That is the question. And there are a bunch of principles that we can introduce. And there are two very important modeling elements that I want to introduce. And those are a little bit more complex than we're used to, namely, what are prices in this context? Now note that collective goods have a tremendous effect on the economy. It can be the whole architecture of the economy. It can impact all the aspects of the economy. For example, a road system will literally impact all aspects of the economy. It will impact preferences because of the consumption side of the road system, and it will also impact production, of course, because it is an intermediary input to production processes. Yeah. So we need to take that into account when we are talking about prices, commodity prices, not prices of collective goods, only the commodity prices. And this leads us then to the introduction of what is called a conjectural price system. The prices of the commodities are subject to what type of configuration we have in the on the collective goods. Yeah. So a certain road system leads to certain conditions in the economy, and that allows us, that imposes a certain commodity price, because the whole cost structure depends on this road system. Yeah. And if you have higher production costs, of course, there should be higher commodity prices that compensate for that, and that is normally the case in all the examples that we've seen. So that's exactly what is modeled here, right? The Z is in some sense part of the price system. Namely, it is setting the conditions for the prices, right? And so to every, we assign a price system to every incarnation, every configuration of the collective good. for every Z, we have a P of Z. Yeah. So commodity prices are purely conjectural, as we call that. So if we are contemplating a different collective good configuration, we can then read from the conjectural price system how that would affect the prices in the economy, right? And so this becomes very important information. You need that information to make rational decisions about these collective good configurations. This is a purely theoretical exercise, I want to emphasize again. It is not very practical because we are completely unable to do this in reality, of course. When we are thinking about Brexit, how would Brexit affect the prices in the economy for standard commodities? Of course, there is an impact, a tremendous impact possibly. And we have seen that here in Northern Ireland already. Prices have gone up. Well, how can you assess that before you make a decision to do Brexit? Well, you need to take that into account in some sense. And that is that conjectural price system, right? So conjectural price systems are required to make proper rational decisions about these things. This is a relatively recent development in the theory, by the way, that the insight that this is required, because traditional public goods in the traditional Lindahl model do not require that. You have there a fixed price per unit of public good, as we can call that. Secondly, we need a tax system. We need to pay for the collective good. How do we do that? Well, what individuals pay can be negative. In other words, we also need to contemplate the possibility that agents are compensated for the disutility that a collective good imposes. Brexit is again a great example. Some people will be greatly affected by that. They might have to shut down their whole business, or they might have to reconfigure their business completely due to Brexit. We've seen that, a lot of news about small businesses not being able to export anymore to the EU or import from the EU, having to reconstruct or reconfigure their business. Well, they should be compensated for that. In a proper assessment of the collective good, this should be possible. And this is what we should do. So we should introduce the possibility that there are subsidies as well as taxes, but the net result of all the taxes and subsidies when we add them up should be to pay for the particular configuration that we are implementing. Okay, this allows us a model then. I impose a positive amount when I mean a tax, and I impose a negative amount when I want to talk about a subsidy. So a tax is a certain amount, and a negative tax is a subsidy. This we bring together in a tax subsidy system that assigns to every agent and every collective good configuration a certain amount of tax or subsidy. Any questions so far? So A and B together, the conjectural price system and the tax subsidy system, those are the elements of the valuation. So a combination of a conjectural price system together with the tax subsidy system, that is the valuation of a collective good. Okay, now we can talk about what the conditions are under which these entities have to be determined. What are the rules that we want to impose? Now, in order to talk about rules, we need to talk about states in the economy. And states, we amend what we mean with a state. We called it allocation in the past. An allocation of consumption bundles and allocation of production plans. We used that in the past in essentially in the production network where production was fixed essentially. But here we need to amend that, and we need also to make the collective good something that we select. So we select a collective good configuration. We select an allocation of consumption bundles, an assignment of consumption bundles, and we select an assignment of production plans. And those three elements together, they form a state. Note that the production plan that we assign needs to be feasible in the sense that the G is in the production set that belongs to this particular configuration. Right? So if we go for a different configuration, we might have to change the production plan that corresponds to that, because there are there's this widespread impact of the collective good on production. Now, we combine now a state with a valuation system, as we call that, the price system and the taxation vis system, the tax subsidy system. Yeah, and we call a state supported if it satisfies the following properties. And there are quite a few of them. First of all, a feasibility condition. If we add up all these bundles that we have, it should fit. We should produce enough to be able to create all this, to implement it, right? So if we add up all the consumption bundles and we add to that the expenditures on the collective good, it needs to add up exactly to what we produce in the economy, and that is the sum of the production plans. Yeah. So this is a feasibility condition. Secondly, there needs to be optimality in the budget of the authority, so to say. If we have an authority in the economy that imposes a price system and a tax subsidy system, we can think of such a theoretical authority that does that, like a market or an auctioneer or some entity. Then there should not be a surplus or a deficit. So all the taxes collected exactly add up to expenditure, the monetary expenditure on the provision of the collective good. So all taxes collected in combination with all the subsidies that are paid, the net amount that is collected should exactly cover the cost of the collective good configuration, the Z that we have there. And that is this formulation here, the budget balance. Second, with regard to the provision of the collective good, this provision should be optimal, namely that budget balance is not just any budget balance, it is in fact the maximum of the surplus. So the surplus is total net collected taxes minus the expenditure of on the collective good. That difference is the surplus. When that difference is negative, then you talk about a deficit. Now, the maximum surplus is exactly reached in the for the plan Z. Yeah. So Z is part of that state that we consider here, and that state is in some sense optimal for with regard to the provision under the prevailing price system. Yeah. Are there any questions about these three conditions? All right. So condition 1 is a feasibility condition, standard. Conditions 2 and 3 are in some sense, when we think of a government, these are conditions on optimality of government. Government will tax exactly enough to pay for the collective good, and the provision of the collective good is optimal in the sense that it minimizes the deficit or it maximizes the surplus. And then we have our standard conditions on the behavior of our individual agents, namely, given the collective good configuration, every agent will select an optimal production plan, an income maximizing production plan. And whatever taxes a person has to pay, it is covered by the income that is generated. So the income is maximal given the collective good configuration and given my productive abilities in that collective good configuration, so to say. That income is maximal and it covers my tax. Yeah. Secondly, we have optimality in consumption. This is the optimality of the consumption side. If an agent is contemplating a better situation for herself, namely a consumption bundle F prime and a collective good configuration Z prime that gives a utility level that exceeds the proposed utility level, namely given the proposed consumption bundle and the proposed collective good configuration Z, well, then it becomes unaffordable. And what does unaffordable mean? The expenditure side exceeds the income side. So on the expenditure side, we have here the cost under Z prime of the consumption bundle. So we have the prices that prevail under configuration Z prime, and the taxes that I have to pay, or the subsidy that I receive under Z prime, that has to exceed the income that I can generate under Z prime. And that income that I can generate under Z prime is selecting a production plan that maximizes my income under the price system and the productive abilities that I have. Yeah. So here we see the production and the consumption side coming together. You do not longer have the dichotomy necessarily of the production decision and the consumption decision because of the collective good being in there, right? We can also make a consumption decision in some sense about a collective good because this is part of the consumption decision by the agent. And what we do here is we coordinate through the price system and the tax subsidy system all these decisions, all of these different agents. They all decide that Z is indeed the optimal thing. And that we can only do by giving appropriate taxes and subsidies in the first place. And secondly, we need to construct the conjectural prices in such a way that it is supporting that as well. Yeah? So here we have no longer a dichotomy between consumption decisions and production decisions. It's an important footnote to have here. Yeah. Okay, so given this, right, we have here a state is a complete material configuration of the economy, collective good configuration, and an assignment of consumption and production plans. Yeah. A supported state can be fully implemented, properly incentivized through a conjectural price system and an individualized tax subsidy system, right? And so we finance not only the collective good provision, but we also steer everybody to agree on the provision of a certain Z. Now, this is highly theoretical because in reality, this is extremely hard. But what we show is that this is possible, right? You can construct proper support for collective goods in this way. We are able to implement Brexit in a proper way by constructing a proper price system and a proper tax subsidy system. And we can put everybody on the same page with regard to Brexit. And Brexit is then optimally provided. And this is a purely theoretical exercise because in reality, this never ever happens. In reality, it's one big huge mess, and it is always wrong what is done in reality. Even the most simplistic collective goods are underprovided, overprovided, not provided. It's essentially one big trial and error thing. But what this shows is that we can properly incentivize the provision of collective goods. What I want to do next is a bunch of examples, and I will do 3 examples. And I will start with an extremely classical public good, and I will treat it as a public good, a Samuelsonian public good as it is called. I'm referring to Samuelson's paper in 1954, in which for the very first time public goods were valued, essentially. A proper interpretation of public goods was developed, and it was shown how to model those things. Yeah. Well, let's consider a non-rivalrous and non-excludable public good that is measurable. And so we assume there's monotonicity even in the preferences for this public good. And we assume that this public good can be called policing, public security. And policing is measured by how many police officers are in the police force. And everybody likes more police officers rather than fewer police officers. Yeah. Using the social division of labor, we can do this. We can model this appropriately, and we can model the role of a police officer in the social division of labor as something that implements this. Yeah. And then we will see that we can support the Pareto optimal configuration in this situation with the optimal level of policing through an appropriate system of conjectural prices and a tax subsidy system. Let's do the technicalities of the model. We need 2 commodities. The first is a consumable, just something that is needed to survive, so to say. We need that to live. And secondly, there is a very specific form of human capital, namely policing capital, right? So police officers. Yeah. So an agent can be a farmer producing 1 unit of X, or a police officer producing 1 unit of Y. And Y is needed in the provision of the collective good. So policing is modeled now as a fraction of the population that is a police officer. So Z is a number between 0 and 1, being the fraction of people that are police officers. And the cost of providing policing at level Z is the bundle 0, Z. Yeah. So, or the size of the population, but we assume that the size of the population is 1, right, for simplicity. So we work with percentages in some sense. So Z is the percentage of people being a police officer, and that exactly measures the size of the collective good configuration, and it exactly measures also the input that is required for the production of this collective good, and the provision of this collective good. Now, policing has no effect on productivity, so everybody has exactly the same choices. It can be a farmer or a police officer, and that's it. That's our production set. The production set corresponds to two production plans, 1-0 and 0-1. And that's it. Z has no role to play. Z only shows up in the preferences. Right? So all economic agents are assumed to take two things into account, namely how much they consume of the composite consumable and how much they consume of policing. And they uniformly agree that more policing is better. And so this can be expressed as a utility function of the type as we have with the Cobb-Douglas, X times Z. And the higher X is and the higher Z is, the more utility they have. So more is better. So utility is monotonic in the public good, and this is a standard assumption that Samuelson already introduced. The public good is delivered through the social division of labor, and we introduced an appropriate specialization for that, an appropriate commodity for that. Yeah. So let's go to the description of what is optimal in this case. Optimal is to have half of the population being a police officer and to deliver the collective good, policing at the level half. Everybody consuming half a unit of the consumable, and half of the population becomes a farmer and half of the population becomes a police officer. That is the configuration of the economy, the state that we are describing. Now, the state can be supported by the following price configuration. The prices of both goods are independent of the policing level. So the price becomes 1,1. This is also a standard result from classical public goods theory, that prices do not have to be conjectural. And we have a standard public good with monotonicity and measurement and all that. The tax subsidy system is that everybody has to pay a tax at the level of policing. So more policing, higher tax, but everybody pays exactly the same. So completely equal. So that is the main insight. This is the example. And we see here that we get, in some sense, a Lindahl equilibrium here, because the prices are not depending on the collective good configuration, and the tax subsidy system is quite straightforward. There's no subsidies, for example, here. Yeah, although that might be necessary if there are major differences in the preferences. This concludes this example. Are there any questions with regard to this example? I hope this example clarifies a little bit the definitions that we had of these principles of valuation of collective goods. And this is not straightforward. But this is the most straightforward example you can construct, most straightforward application. All right, if there's no question, what I will do is have a very short break of a few minutes, let's say a 3-minute break to catch my breath. I see you 2 minutes after 1/2 past 1632, so to say. All right, I'm a bit tight on time. I hope I will be able to finish on time. The two more examples that I would like to do. The first one is going back to the tragedy of the commons, because one of the questions is then, well, are there different ways to look at the commons? And there are different ways to look at the commons. And we know from practice that a lot have been done with regard to the commons, in particular with regard to fishing and pollution. These quotient solutions, so to say, are very appealing. But in practice, there have been many, many solutions as well. So in particular, Ostrom has considered the commons. So let's look at a very specific case of a commons. Let's assume that the commons is essentially in the production of a consumable, but there is no preference over the commons. The commons is not in the utility function. So this is exactly the opposite of the policing example, where policing had no effect on productive abilities, but it was only in the preferences. Here we have the opposite. The commons determines very much productive ability, but there's no, it doesn't show up in the preferences. Yeah. What we can do then is a solution in the sense of Ostrom, Eleanor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. She studied collective goods, and in particular the commons, in all kinds of practical cases, historical as well as contemporary. And she found many, many solutions that were implemented in societies for the commons. And many of the solutions are that of a so-called managed commons, a regulated commons. And so we can use rights to access the commons. So we can use usage rights. The usage rights don't have to be tradable. They can be assignments of rights to individuals that are not necessarily tradable, as in the quotient solution to the commons. They can just be given by government to individual users of the commons, and they might not be tradable. Right? So we have this model here. We assume that there are users' rights to the commons, but they are not tradable. There is no market in this for users' rights. We do not make the commons into a semi-collective good, as we can call that. We keep the collective good nature of the commons in that regard. So two commodities, a consumable that is produced, produced, and a commons-based consumable that is produced by using the commons as an intermediary input. And the more you can use the commons, the higher that input is, and the higher the productivity of a certain individual is. Yeah. As before, the total size of the commons is a certain fixed number, gamma, as we had before. And it can be freely used. There's no cost related to the usage. And that is important. There will be a fee to use it, but there will be no cost related to using it. Right? So the provision of the commons is free in some sense. So I assign then individual usage rights. What is an individual usage right? That is how much can be extracted from the commons by that particular individual. And we call it gamma sub A. And we put a bound on that. We assume that it's not more than 2 times the commons, because if you have that right to extract 2 times the commons, then you completely destroy the commons, so to say. Yeah. Note that all of this is again percentages and things, so it becomes a little bit more problematic. Yeah. Anyway, what are now collective good configurations? Those are nothing but assignments of usage rights. And so the gamma functions can be introduced, and the total size that is assigned is gamma. Yeah. And in fact, it is the integral, to be precise, because we talk about percentages here. There's no cost to providing the commons. The commons is just available. It is there. It can be used. And there's no cost in the terms of commodities used to provide the commons or to provide the assignment of usage rights. If there's a bureaucratic process required to assign these usage rights, we can model that here by introducing a third commodity, namely bureaucratic labor, and then we can implement here the cost of doing that. But we assume that away, there is no cost to us to creating this. Then with regard to individual ability, the production set that we get is that somebody can be a home producer of X, 1, 0 is then the production plan, or a producer of Y using the commons, and how much of the commons is used, that is described by that gamma. And then what are the preferences of everybody in this economy? Well, both X and Y are equally important. And again, we use a Cobb-Douglas function to describe that. What is the main result? The main result is the following. The following state is Pareto optimal. Namely, usage rights are only assigned to half of the population, and that half of the population is also the producer of Y. So half of the population is producing X, and they have no right to use the commons. And they consume 3/4 of X and 3 times gamma over 2 of the Y. The Y producers, they have full rights to use the commons. Since we talk about percentages here, and we talk really about integrals here, you need to multiply this number of the usage, this 2 times gamma, with a half of the population size. And you see then that the total sum of the gamma is half times 2 gamma, which is exactly gamma. So the commons is completely used here in that regard. Yeah. So because we have percentages here, it becomes a little bit more difficult to give a direct interpretation of these numbers, because you would say, oh, every individual user is using the commons twice over, but that is not really the case. Yeah, it is. This number is not related necessarily to the size gamma directly. It is indirectly related, because you need to multiply it by the number of users to get the real usage. Anyway, that's a footnote. So Y producers consume 3/4 of X and gamma over 2 of Y, and they are Y producers, of course, and they produce to the fullest extent of their ability. Yeah. The result is that this configuration is Pareto optimal. And can we support that then? Yes, the answer is yes. We can support it by the following system. Again, prices are stable. It doesn't matter what the usage assignment is of the commons. Prices are exactly the same, 2 times gamma, 1. The larger the gamma is, the larger the commons is, the higher the price, the relative price of X, And the lower the relative price of Y, it becomes easier to produce Y, as you can see. And we get more Y in the economy, of course. Then there's a tax subsidy system that is transferring wealth from the Y producers to the X producers. So Y producers are taxed gamma, and that is then transferred to the X producers. And they get a subsidy of gamma, as you can see. So the total collected taxes is 0, but the X producers and the Y producers, they exchange essentially compensation to each other through an authority probably. This is also independent of the usage rights assignment. So all the X producers always get the same subsidy, and the Y producers always pay the same tax. Yeah. So there's a wealth transfer from one group to the other to support this system. So this is, as you can see, a very different example. The example is that of a managed commons. And in a managed commons, we are able to, with the appropriate system of financial incentives, so to say, to implement that. And we can go to a Pareto optimal usage of the commons in that case. Yeah. Are there any questions about this example? So I think the strength of the example shows that you have very stable price subsidy system, price tax subsidy system, the financial system extremely stable. It is not affected at all by the usage assignment, and it gives the appropriate incentives to guide people to optimal usage of the commons. And this is solution of the managed commons, so to say, it's very close to the solution of the quotient solution to the commons, namely the tradable usage rights. Yeah. Okay, final example is an example of the knowledge economy. There's a lot of stuff going on about the knowledge economy. This is the successor to the information economy in some sense. The collective good is knowledge, collective knowledge, knowledge at the foundation of the social division of labor. How do we produce stuff? That knowledge is a collective good. And for the Smithian logic of the social division of labor, this is essential. Namely, this is the engine for economic development and growth. You have the collective knowledge that we have of production technologies. That is the essence of the economy. And everybody can specialize in any of the professions that we have and use the collective knowledge that we have in our economy to the fullest to provide, to create wealth, so to say. Yeah. So this fits extremely well with this understanding of this knowledge as a collective good, because it is also delivered through a public education system under this Smithian logic. Yeah. Now we do some simplifying assumptions here. We assume that it is costless to access the knowledge for an individual. They just get an assignment of knowledge in some sense. But it is costly to generate the knowledge. So it is costly in terms of commodity usage. You need to use the commodities in the economy to generate the knowledge. Knowledge impacts productivity, but there is no preferential impact. So people do not care about the consumption of knowledge. They only care that knowledge is productive and that it increases their productivity. Yeah. So these are simplifying assumptions. Again, we have two consumables, X and Y. And the production of X is not subject to this knowledge. We assume that only Y is produced through the usage of this collective knowledge. Yeah. And so the collective knowledge configuration, so to say, is simply a measurement of the overall knowledge level in the society. And that knowledge level can be any number between 0 and 1. It's just a tool. We assume it is measurable. And the higher that knowledge level is, the more expenditures we need to create that. So we introduce a cost function. Now this looks like a very complicated cost function, but it is increasing in Z. But we were able to construct this example, so we got very easy and simple supporting price systems. So that's the main reason why we have this rather complex cost function. But as you can see, it is properly increasing in Z. Both goods are necessary to produce a knowledge level. Both X and Y are needed. So I need to produce knowledge to produce Y, but I also need Y to produce knowledge. So there is a chicken and egg problem in this example. Yeah. So that is what I state here. Now every agent has the same production set. And that production set is that they can either be an X producer or a Y producer. X is home produced. You generate 1 unit of X. When you're a Y producer, you use that common knowledge. And it depends on the knowledge level in society, how much you can produce. The higher the knowledge level, the more you can produce. So here we choose very simply that the production level is simply that Z itself. And Z is at most 1. So if the knowledge level is at level 1, you use all commodities in the economy to produce the maximal level of Z. It becomes unaffordable. That should also be clear from the whole configuration. And this cost function, the cost of producing Z at level 1 are so high, it's unaffordable. Agents only care about the private commodities X and Y. They don't care about knowledge, and they don't care about how that is generated. There's no impact whatsoever. Yeah. Okay. What is the Pareto optimal state in this case? Well, knowledge is produced at a level 1/3. And everybody consumes exactly the same bundle, 1/3 of X and 1/9 of Y. Half of the population is working in the X production and half of the population in the Y production. And so that Y production, of course, is bounded by that level of knowledge of 1/3. And so you can only generate 0 1/3 in that situation. Yeah. Now, this configuration is Pareto optimal, and it is supported by a rather simplistic, straightforward price tax subsidy system. First of all, what are the prices of the goods? Again, the price of X depends on the productivity of Y, on the knowledge that we have. And the more knowledge we have, the costlier it is to purchase X, and the cheaper it is to produce Y and to purchase Y. Yeah. So that is why the price of X is Z itself. And what is the system of taxes that is imposed to support this situation? That is simply a tax system that is quadratic in the level of Z. And this relates to cost, of course. And this formula for the cost, that was rather complex, that leads to this simplistic, straightforward formula for the tax system in this particular case. So regardless of what the knowledge level is in the society, everybody pays the same tax, and that tax is simply the square of the knowledge level. Yeah? And so all these agents can now make those decisions, but they all agree that they want knowledge level 1/3 because that gives them their optimal consumption and production plan. Yeah. So so you see here that we get a continuum of Pareto optima, if you think deeper about it, that can all be supported by their own price subsidy system. And this is just one particular example of it. Yeah. Okay. Any questions with regard to this final example of the knowledge economy? So this gets pretty close to what I did earlier on in the module, talking about increasing returns to specialization, and that this is driven by the Smithian logic, the deepening of the social division of labor. All that stuff is related to this understanding of that there is a collective knowledge in the background, and that collective knowledge is a collective good. And you see here that it can be priced. This has a value. This value is not straightforward because it is a rather complex configuration, but we can attach values to things, and we can assess things using these values, and we can literally compute the optimal behavior of these economic agents and the optimal provision level of knowledge using all these numbers that we assign here. Yeah. Okay. So if there are no questions, I'm going to conclude then. A final remark. We've seen examples here of collective goods that were non-institutional. These are more traditional goods. We talked about policing. We talked about street lights, similar to policing in some sense. We talked about knowledge. We talked about the commons. Those are quantifiable things. However, institutions can be priced here as well in exactly the same manner, in exactly the same model. Institutions can then not be quantified. Different institutions are simply different Zs in that that abstract set of configurations. And they can impact in a variety of ways productivities in the economy and the preferences of agents in the economy. And we can price them. We can value those configurations but it is much harder. We need all the details of this, and it becomes a very complex issue, even when you only have a finite number of configurations to consider. But we can do it. It's a lot of work, but we can do it. Yeah. So modeling institutions and valuing institutions can be done in this theory of collective goods using exactly the same language and the same tools as we looked at before. And the example of the managed commons, by the way, is the closest to that. Now, I applied in previous research this logic of valuing things to market institutions directly. So we can directly talk about whether you want to create a market for a good or not, whether you want to declare an economic good to be tradable or not. And this has happened historically, right? Historically, since the Middle Ages, we have been trading more and more and more goods. And this tradability is a construct. We literally constructed these markets. We introduced laws to make certain things tradable, to accommodate certain things and to promote certain things, right? So the tradability of labor, for example, it's a long road of trial and error. And even in the 20th century, anti-discrimination laws were necessary to make more and more of these goods, in particular labor, tradable on an equal footing, and to create a real market environment to be able to trade this in an appropriate way. These things are not costless. It is very costly to make something tradable or not. Yeah, and I want to emphasize that here. So I refer here to the publication that I have on this, and we focused mainly on labor there in an example. Transaction costs are important in that regard. Transaction costs are a certain cost impact on the economy that I did not talk about here, but can be included in the theory, and it can be treated in the same way. And this is very much the case in the tradability of goods. Transaction costs are a key element to be considered. In the whole discussion, I hope you've seen that collective goods are of the utmost importance. These are the key things in our economy, our global economy. Everything related to the environment, everything related to the institutions that run the economy, the impact of COVID, the vaccination programs, all of that are collective goods. All of that bear costs. All of that needs to be implemented in a decent way. All of that is extremely hard. And I hope you understand now a little bit better what the main issues are with regard to collective goods. The near impossibility to get people on the same page, and that this valuation system that I just described now in the past lecture for those examples are very advanced things to just get people on the same page, to agree on a certain configuration of the collective good to be implemented. And this is extremely difficult and cumbersome, as I hope I have shown. Anyway, collective goods are essential, and I wish there was room in the program to talk about it much more, and to really explore this much deeper than I did today. But it's not to be. Of course, you can use your dissertation to dig deeper into these issues, especially since any issue that you dig into is, in some sense, you encounter these collective goods there somewhere, for sure. And what economists usually do is just assume them away, not talk about them. Let's not talk about these difficult things. Let's put them away. We only look at the data that is in front of us about individual behavior, about individual consumption bundles and production plans and whatever you have, individual decisions. But there are these collective things in the background, and they play a tremendous role. Okay, this concludes today's presentations. Next week, I have one more session. I do a little review of everything that we talked about, and I will introduce the assignment, the final assignment. And after that, I also will post that assignment in the assignment section of Canvas. And then it is an essay assignment as agreed. So I will talk about that next time after doing a kind of review of going over all the elements that I touched upon in this module, to bring it a little bit together, giving it a little bit of a support, so to say. Are there any final questions with regard to today's lectures? All right. Well, then I see you next week. And then we will conclude the module. And possibly there will be quite a few questions maybe next time. All right, till then, bye.